Hey guys, and welcome back to another set of anatomy notes. Today is all going to be about the circulatory system, talking about blood, how it flows through our body, how it goes through our heart, and what our heart does in order to pump it to all the different fingers, toes, and muscle and bone cells that need the oxygen and the nutrients that our blood contains. So let's get into it. Righty, here we go. So the circulatory system, like I said, it's all about different organs and tissues that are moving blood cells and other cells around our body. So the cells in our body are making waste and they need oxygen and nutrients. So our circulatory system drops off the oxygen and nutrients to them and picks up the waste that our cells have been producing. So you might also hear me sometimes refer to it in these notes as the cardiovascular system. It just means the same thing, the heart pushing blood around our body in order to transport nutrients and oxygen and get rid of waste. So over here in this picture, you can see that we've got our heart right in the middle of our chest here. And that's connected to all of our arteries and veins that are taking stuff either into our heart from our body or from our heart to the rest of our body. So there are kind of three major features that our circulatory system has. There's some sort of fluid that's being transported. In this case, it is our blood in our body. There is a system of vessels, like tubes, that are going throughout our body in order for this blood to flow through. So this would be like our arteries and veins that I'll talk about in a little bit. And we need some sort of pump. So in the case of humans, we use a heart in order to pump that fluid and circulate it throughout all of our different vessels and all the different parts of our body. So what all is being carried as the circulatory system is working in its normal way? We have all sorts of different hormones that different glands are producing around our body that need to be transported to specific areas. We have oxygen from our lungs that all of our cells need in order to create energy. Oxygen is a really important molecule that we use as part of the energy process in our cells. So we need that oxygen that we breathe in from the air. And nutrients that we get from the digestive system. So we talked about digestion in the last set of notes and all the different nutrients and those macromolecules that we get from it. It's the circulatory system in our blood that actually carries those nutrients from our stomach and our intestines to the rest of the cells in our body. So we've got hormones, oxygen, and nutrients that are all being transported around as part of this circulatory system. So in vertebrate hearts, so humans are vertebrates, meaning we have a backbone or a spine. And invertebrates, there are generally two different sets of chambers that the heart is kind of separated into. There's the top chambers and the bottom chambers. So we call the top chambers the atria or atrium if there's just one of them. And these are what receive blood into the heart from the rest of the body, either from cells in our different tissues or cells from our lungs. So the atria in the top of the heart get blood in from the body. The ventricles in the bottom of our heart, they get the blood from the atria and then push that blood out into the rest of the body or out to the lungs. So the atria receive blood from the body and then send it to the ventricles. The ventricles receive the blood from the atria and then pump it out of the heart into the rest of the body or out to the lungs. So atria up top getting blood in, ventricles on the bottom pushing blood out. So in humans and other mammals specifically, and also in birds, we have a 4-chambered heart. So we have 2 atria up at the top of our heart and 2 ventricles down at the bottom of our heart. And these guys are totally separated from each other through this kind of wall of tissue right here. So 1 atrium on the left side, 1 atrium on the right side, 1 ventricle on the left side, 1 ventricle on the right side. And it's going to be really important for you guys to know what is the name of these different chambers and kind of the general process that blood goes through the heart, which is what we'll spend most of today going over. So like I said, in humans, we have this 4-chambered heart. It's located kind of right in the middle of our body. It's usually about the size of your fist. So if you take like your hand, your fist like this, and put it kind of right in the middle of your chest here, that's a pretty good approximation of both the size and the location of your heart. The heart is pretty much one entire muscle. So it's its own specialized set of muscle cells that we'll talk about later on in the semester when we get to the muscular system. But it's specialized muscle cells that help to beat that heart every single second of every day to keep that oxygen and nutrients moving. So the name for that tissue that kind of divides our heart is called the septum, right in here. And then each side of the septums has 2 chambers, 1 atrium at the top and 1 atrium at the bottom. Again, remember the upper chambers, the atria, receive blood in, and then the ventricles at the bottom push blood out. So you may have noticed that it seems like this picture of a heart is labeled backwards. It says right atrium and right ventricle over here, but when we're looking at it, that's our left. Same thing on this side. We have the left atrium and the left ventricle over here, but when we look at it, that's our right. That's because whenever you look at the picture of a heart, you have to think about it as if you're looking at a heart that is inside somebody's body. So if we have like a person and we've got the neck and the shoulders, arms, and legs, and then all right, so there's my weird little cartoon person. And for this person, if they're looking at us, this is the right side of their body, right? This would be their right arm and their right leg, because this is their face right here. And this would be the left side of their body. This would be their left arm and their left leg and their left eye. So whenever we look at the picture of a heart, we're pretending like we're looking at a heart that is inside somebody's body right here. So that's why we call this side of the heart the right side and this side of the heart the left side when we look at it in a picture like this, because we're pretending that we're looking at it inside the right or the left side of somebody's body. So 1 heart, 4 chambers, 2 atria up at the top, 2 ventricles down at the bottom. The right side of the heart has a atria and a ventricle, and the left side of the heart has an atrium and a ventricle. So 2 atriums, 2 ventricles, 4 chambers in total. All right. So we have our heart, and it's constantly moving blood in and out from the heart to the rest of our body. Well, how does it actually do this? What is the process for blood coming into the heart, going out to the lungs, coming back to the heart, and then going out to the body? So it all starts on the left-hand side of the heart. So we have low oxygen blood, that's represented by this blue arrow down here. That means that it's low in oxygen. Comes into the right side of the heart from the rest of the body. So that blood has been circulating for a little while. It's gotten rid of all of its oxygen and nutrients, and now it's coming back up into the heart. So it enters the right atrium, because remember, the atria are where the blood enters the heart. It's then pumped down into the right ventricle. So once our blood gets pumped into the ventricle, the next beat will pump that blood out of the heart, out to the lungs. So this big tube right here, this is going to the lungs. After it goes to the lungs, it then gets brought back to the heart, and it enters into the left atrium. So the right ventricle sends blood out of the heart. That blood goes to the lungs and picks up a whole bunch of oxygen. That blood then comes back into the heart and the left atrium. So right atrium, right ventricle, lungs, left atrium. That's where we've gone so far. Now, once that blood has gone into our left atrium, it then has to go where? To the other chamber that's on the left side of the heart, the left ventricle. So it's going to go down from the atrium, get pumped down into the ventricle, and then from there, it'll be carried out through the aorta, a major artery that leaves the heart, and that is brought to the rest of the body. So the left ventricle is responsible for pumping blood out of the heart and into the entire rest of your body. So it comes in low oxygen from your body onto the right-hand side of the heart. It goes into that atrium, from the atrium to the ventricle. From the ventricle, it goes out to the lungs. From the lungs, it comes back in nice and full of oxygen into the left atrium. It then gets pumped down into the left ventricle and then out through the aorta to the rest of the body. So, atria take in blood, ventricles pump out blood. The right side of the heart takes in blood that's low oxygen from your body. The left side of the heart takes in blood that's high oxygen and pumps it out to the rest of your body. So right side, lungs, left side, body. Comes in through the atria, goes down to the ventricle, and then gets pumped out. So when people describe the heartbeat, you usually think of it as like a bum bum, bum bum, bum bum kind of beat, right? That's because we have what's called the dual pump operation in our heart, which is where that first pump is when the blood goes from the atria into the ventricles. And then that second bump is when the ventricles contract and force blood out through the arteries and into the rest of the body or out to the lungs. So each pom pom is the atria fills up and then pump down into the ventricles and boom out into the rest of the body. All right, so there are two areas that our blood goes after it leaves the heart. There is what's called the pulmonary circulation, which is where we leave from the heart and go to the lungs. And there is systemic circulation, which is where we leave from the heart and go to the rest of the body. So our right side of the heart gets blood into the heart from what's called the vena cava. There are two different vena cava. There is the superior, which brings blood in from like your head and your chest. And there is the inferior, which brings blood up from the lower part of your body. So these two, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, bring that low oxygen blood from the rest of your body into the right side of your heart. Like we just talked about, it goes into the right atrium, gets pumped down into the right ventricle, and then gets pumped out into the pulmonary circulate, where it's going to go to the lungs. So the pulmonary artery is the name for the blood vessel that takes the blood from the heart to the lungs. So arteries always take blood away from the heart, and we'll talk about them in a little bit more detail in a second. And so the pulmonary artery is what takes blood from the heart to the lungs. Once it makes it into the lungs, then it picks up a whole bunch of oxygen, gets rid of a whole bunch of waste like CO2, and then travels back into the heart through the pulmonary veins. So as we'll talk about in a second, veins always bring blood back to the heart. And so we go from the lungs through the pulmonary veins and back into the left side of the heart. So now we have lots and lots of oxygen in our blood. It goes into that left atrium, gets pumped down to the left ventricle, and then pumped out through the aorta to the rest of the body. And that's what's called the systemic circuit, is when the blood leaves the heart, goes to the rest of the body, drops off that oxygen and nutrients, and then brings the blood back up into the heart. So when we leave the right side of the heart, we go through the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein to get back into the heart. When we leave from the left side of the heart, we go out through the aorta and come back through the vena cava. So this is how blood gets cycled around your body. From the body, into the heart, into the pulmonary arteries, through the lungs, into the pulmonary veins, back into the heart, and then out through the aorta to the rest of the body. So again, the pulmonary circuit, it's all about coming from the right side of the heart here, our right ventricle. The pulmonary arteries take blood to the left and right lungs. And then the pulmonary veins carry that blood back into the left side of the heart. So when we leave the right side of the heart, we're very low oxygen. We go to the lungs through those pulmonary arteries, pick up oxygen, and then travel through the pulmonary veins back into the left side of the heart, where now we are nice and full of oxygen. Then we're ready to go out to the rest of the body. So the systemic circuit is when we leave from the left side. This is the left ventricle down here. We leave the left side of the heart through our aorta, which then splits off into lots of smaller arteries and goes to all the different fingers, toes, muscles, bones, places in your body. And then the blood loses its oxygen and comes back through the vena cava. So when we're coming from our lower body up into the heart, this is the inferior vena cava. And then when we're coming down from our head and upper body into the heart, that is our superior vena cava. And then the whole process starts again. We go through the right atrium and right ventricle, get pumped out through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, come back from the pulmonary veins into the heart, and then go back out through the aorta once again. So as it's traveling through the aorta and through our arteries in our bodies, it's carrying all that wonderful oxygen and nutrients that the rest of the cells of our bodies need. It then picks up waste products like carbon dioxide and other wastes that cells have produced and carry it back to the heart so we can get rid of it in our lungs. So our blood vessels are these tubes that are actually carrying the blood throughout our body. So the aorta, the vena cava, the pulmonary arteries and veins, these are kind of the major blood vessels that are in our bodies. But obviously, there's thousands and thousands of them, all kind of crisscrossing all along the inside of our body. We can split them up into kind of 3 different groups depending on what they do. So we have our arteries and their smaller version, the arterioles. We have the veins and the smaller version, the venules, and the capillaries, which are where the arteries and the veins meet in these very, 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 very tiny little tubes. So if you took all of your blood vessels and laid them end to end next to each other, there'd be over 80,000 miles of blood vessels that transport blood throughout your body. Our arteries are blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart to other parts of our body. So that's how I remember what the arteries do, is that arteries start with an A, and away starts with an A. So arteries carry the blood away from the heart. So that pulmonary artery goes from the heart to the lungs, so away from the heart to the lungs. And the aorta goes away from the heart to the rest of the body. Our veins are what carry blood from the body back into the heart. So I kind of remember it as veins has the word in it, and veins go into the heart. So that pulmonary vein goes from the lungs into the heart, and that vena cava goes from the upper and lower parts of your body into that right side of your heart. Capillaries are where the arteries and the veins meet. So these are extremely teeny, teeny, tiny tubes that crisscross over the cells of our body and take the blood from the arteries to the body cells and then return that blood into the veins. So arteries are going away from the heart, veins are going into the heart, and capillaries are these tiny tubes where the veins and the arteries meet up with each other. and exchange that oxygen and nutrients and waste. So here's just kind of a super basic overview of what some of the different major types of arteries are in our body that separate out and split off into smaller and smaller tubes. Again, the arteries are going away from the heart, and then the arteries and the veins meet up in these tiny little capillary areas, and then the veins are what pick up that blood and take it back into the heart. So the veins branch off, or the arteries carrying the blood branch off into these capillary areas, and then the veins pick up that blood and take it back into the heart. So our arteries are, again, going away from the heart. They're either going into the lungs or into all the different cells in our bodies. They're aligned with this smooth muscle because the pressure coming out of that left side of the heart is a pretty good amount of pressure. And so these arteries have to kind of control the blood flow through that pressure. So they have a little bit more muscle on them than the veins do. Both of them need muscle so that they can kind of expand and contract in order to carry more blood or less blood at certain amounts of times. The arteries are just a little bit more muscular. And again, they're all about taking that blood away from the heart. So the ventricles in the bottom part of the heart pump the blood out into arteries. Capillaries are the tiny, tiny little tubes that in a lot of cases are only one cell thick. So only one single red or white blood cell can travel through a capillary at a time. They have to go essentially single file. So as they travel through these capillaries, these blood cells are dropping off nutrients and oxygen that the cells need, and picking up carbon dioxide and other wastes that the cells want to get rid of. So by having them go one at a time, they can travel slowly enough to make sure that all of the oxygen and nutrients that need to get dropped off are delivered to where they need to go. Veins have a little bit thinner walls than arteries. Again, they're not quite as intense, and they're all about taking that blood back up into the heart, either from our lungs or from the rest of our body. So they need to basically, if they're going from our toes, they need to fight gravity and pull that blood all the way back up through the veins into our heart. Take it back to the heart so that they can be pumped to, so that this blood can be pumped to the lungs and get rid of all that waste and pick up the oxygen. So we're going back to the heart when we're in the veins. So as our blood is getting pumped around our body, it's exerting pressure on the walls of our arteries and veins. So the heart is pumping really hard and really sending that blood out through the arteries with a pretty good amount of force. And so the way that we can measure how much force is going through our blood is called blood pressure. So you've probably heard of blood pressure before. Your doctor or nurse will almost always take blood pressure at any sort of exam they have to go through, whether it's just a normal checkup or you're in the hospital or something, because blood pressure is a really good early sign if your heart and your arteries and veins are all working correctly, or if there's some sort of issue that's going on. So there's two measurements that doctors and nurses take. You may have heard them read out two numbers when they take your blood pressure, and that's because they're measuring the high and low times of pressure in your blood vessels. And these are called the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure. So the systolic pressure is the bigger number, and this is the pressure that's in your arteries and veins when your blood pressure is at the highest point. So when your heart squeezes and really is forcing that blood through the arteries and veins, that's when you get this systolic pressure, the most pressure because the heart is exerting that pressure onto those blood vessels. The diastolic pressure is when your heart is nice and relaxed and is refilling with blood. And so this is the smaller number in the blood pressure measurement. So your blood pressure is at the lowest point when your heart is relaxed, it's filling up with blood, it's not actively pumping at the moment, and so there's not as much pressure being put on the sides of your arteries and veins. So systolic, the big number that's on the top of your blood pressure measurement, this is when your heart is pumping and contracting and pushing, so it's a higher number. Diastolic is the lower number when your heart is relaxed and is passively filling with blood, not actively pumping and pushing the blood out through your blood vessels. So systolic, high pressure from heart contraction and pushing. Diastolic, low pressure from your heart relaxing. And this is what your doctor or nurse is measuring. They're looking at what is the blood pressure when your heart pumps and gets high, and what is it when it relaxes and goes low. So as your heart pumps and contracts, it's pushing the blood and creating that larger systolic number. As it relaxes and gets nice and filled in from your veins, that's when you have that diastolic lower number. So in general, the way that they measure blood pressure is through this pumping and relaxing mechanism. And in general, you want your blood pressure to be somewhere around what's called 120/80, or 120 for your systolic high pressure and around 80 for your low pressure. So if your measurements are significantly higher than that, like you're measuring somewhere around 135, 140 for your systolic and 90 or 100 for your diastolic, that might be a symbol of high blood pressure. Whereas if your systolic is only around 100, 110, and your diastolic is somewhere around 50 or 60, that's a sign of low blood pressure. There's not as much pressure going through your vessels as there should be. So the next time that you go to your doctor's appointment and you hear them read off your blood pressure, keep an ear open and see if yours is pretty close to that 120/80 mark. So blood is this actual liquid that's being pushed around your blood vessels by your heart. And blood is actually made up of a couple different important components. So the actual liquid that your blood is floating through is called plasma. Have you ever heard of somebody going because they need plasma injection, or because they're going to a clinic where their plasma is getting extracted? That is the liquid part of blood. So it's mostly water with some other materials mixed in. And this is the transportation mechanism for all the rest of the cells and nutrients that are in your bloodstream. So the plasma is the actual kind of liquid that's carrying and pushing everything along. You also have a couple different types of cells that are traveling through your blood as well. So besides all the different nutrients and hormones and stuff like that, you've got red blood cells, white blood cells, and little cells called platelets. Red blood cells are by far the most numerous and the most common, and they are the oxygen carriers of the cell, of the body. So all of that oxygen that we're picking up from our lungs is being trapped by these red blood cells and carried to the rest of the cells in your system. And so these guys are extremely important because every single cell in your body needs oxygen, and it can only get it if it's carried there by these red blood cells. They kind of have like this weird donut looking shape, but they are what make up the most of the cells in your blood. So that's why it has that kind of reddish color, because when the oxygen in your red blood cells, when your red blood cells come into contact with oxygen, they turn a much redder color than when they get rid of their oxygen and are going back to the lungs to get some new ones. We can also have white blood cells, which are kind of these orangey looking guys in this picture right here. So here's our red blood cells, pretty obvious, big red donut looking guys. White blood cells are the disease fighters in your body. So they're responsible for recognizing and attacking viruses and bacteria that get into your body that are not supposed to be there. So they have a way of determining what is supposed to be there and what isn't, and hopefully they will attack and destroy anything in your body that is not supposed to be there, that they do not recognize as being a part of you. We also have these little cells, kind of purpley guys right here. These are called platelets. So whenever you get a cut on your hand or your arm or your leg or whatever it is, you put some pressure on it for a couple seconds, and if it's a small cut, it'll stop bleeding, and within the next couple hours, it'll scab up and then be fully healed. Well, the reason why the bleeding stops and you don't just keep bleeding forever and ever and ever is due to these platelets. So they will actually kind of swarm into an open wound and cause your blood to clot up, get really thick and really solid, and that helps to prevent more blood from leaving through that cut and more blood from being lost from your body. So these platelets help to stop up these openings in the system, stop up these cuts that you get, and slow the loss of blood by clotting it around those open wounds. Some people have diseases where they either don't have platelets or their platelets don't work right, and they have to be very, very, very concerned whenever they get a cut, because any sort of cut that they get, no matter how big or how small it is, will keep bleeding until the actual skin around it has healed. And so they could potentially bleed out and die just from a fairly minor cut on their hand and or their arm or wherever it might be. So these platelets are extremely important for helping to keep the blood inside of our body if we do get an injury that causes the blood to get exposed. All right. So again, these red blood cells, about 99% of the cells in your blood are red blood cells because there's so much oxygen that all the cells in your body need. We have to constantly keep moving these blood cells throughout it. So they're kind of interesting. Red blood cells do not have a nucleus. They're a lot different than other cells. Every single other cell in your body has a nucleus. But since red blood cells are basically just carrying oxygen from place to place, they don't really need one. They're just carriers of this oxygen that you get in your lungs. So they're constantly circulating around through your body, dropping off oxygen into your cells and picking up oxygen when they get back to the lungs. Again, white blood cells are our disease fighters. Here's a really cool picture of one attacking these little E. coli bacteria over here. So they can recognize certain proteins that bacteria or viruses might have that we don't have on our own cells, and then attack the cells that either don't have the right protein or have too many of the wrong proteins. So they're kind of constantly on patrol in your body and will kind of swarm and attack any cell that they perceive as being a threat, as they perceive as being not a part of your normal body systems. And then again, our little platelets are our clotting mechanism. They help the blood to get kind of really thick and sticky and stop it from flowing out of an open cut or wound that you might get. So to finish off today, well, I'll go over a couple kind of major diseases that people deal with that strongly affect the circulatory system. So when we were talking about blood pressure earlier, you've probably heard that a lot about people either having high or low blood pressure. When you have what's called hypertension, that is high blood pressure. So constant high blood pressure. So people who have hypertension usually have to take some sort of blood pressure medication, because if you let that blood pressure sit too high for too long, you're putting a lot of stress on your arteries and your veins. You're putting a lot of stress on the major organs that your arteries and veins travel through, like your heart and your kidneys and your brain. And so you can actually cause a heart attack or kidney failure or a stroke if you operate for too high of a blood pressure for too long. So this is something that doctors are pretty much always checking for whenever you go into doctor's office, is because they want to make sure that your blood pressure is staying within a pretty normal range. A stroke is whenever you have a blood clot that travels up to your brain. So the platelets are supposed to clot blood when there's an open wound, but sometimes blood clots can form inside of your blood vessels as well. And these are really, really dangerous because they block blood from flowing to where it's supposed to go. So if a blood clot travels up to your brain and gets stuck and starts blocking the blood in your brain, you could have what's called a stroke. And so your brain isn't getting enough nutrients and oxygen, and so it can very quickly parts of it can start deteriorating and dying from this blood clot being up there and causing this issue with the blood. You've also probably heard about people having heart attacks. You know, you see it all the time in movies and TV. People all of a sudden go, oh God, my heart. And so a heart attack is like a stroke. It's some sort of blockage in your body. Only in this case, it's not happening in your brain. It's happening in your heart. So there's some sort of blockage or transportation issue that's causing there to be too little blood flow to your heart. So if your heart's not getting enough blood, your heart can't stay fit and oxygenated, and then it's going to immediately start having problems with transporting that blood around to the rest of your body as well. Anemia is whenever people have low levels of hemoglobin, which is the part of the red blood cell that actually binds the oxygen and actually picks up oxygen. And so people who have anemia have to be concerned with the amount of oxygen that their blood is getting. And usually they have to take iron supplements because iron is an extremely important part of hemoglobin. And so people with anemia usually don't have enough hemoglobin due to not having enough iron in their body. And so they might have to take pills or eat a certain diet that makes sure that they get enough iron and can create enough red blood cells to help with their oxygen. Leukemia is a type of disease. It's normally associated with cancer because it's when you have too many white blood cells. So normally, you'd think, oh, white blood cells are good because we want there to be lots in our body to fight off disease. But if we're constantly producing them and creating way too many for our circulatory system and our blood vessels to handle, that can cause a lot of problems for our circulation. And so leukemia is where you have a disease where you're just making way too many white blood cells than what you need. Hemophilia is the disease that I was mentioning earlier, where people don't have enough platelets. So that's these substances. These are the platelets that we were talking about. And so when you don't have platelets in your body working correctly, then any small injury or cut can cause serious problems because the blood isn't clotting up, which could cause somebody to lose too much blood, lose consciousness, and potentially die just from the blood kind of slowly over time, not clotting and being lost through the body through this cut or this wound. And so these people have to be extremely careful. They usually take medication that helps to increase the number of platelets in their body, but they also have to be extremely concerned anytime they get any sort of cut or wound in their skin or on their hands or legs. Right? And that should be everything that you need to know about the circulatory system. So for the worksheet that you guys are going to work on for the circulatory system, it's all about kind of naming and identifying how blood travels through the heart and what are the different structures called and what are they do they do. So it looks something like this. Here we go. There we go. So you don't have to do any coloring if you don't want to. Don't worry about doing the coloring. I'm more concerned with the labels. So we have A, B, and C over on this side, D, E, and F over on this side, and then G and H kind of over here, down here. It describes a little bit of what they do for each one to kind of give you a hint. And so for each one of these labels, A through H, you need to write down if it is the right or the left atrium, the right or the left ventricle, the pulmonary artery, the pulmonary vein, the vena cava, or the aorta. So you should need to use each one of these labels up here only once. So each one of these letters corresponds with one of these labels. So remember, make sure that you can kind of recognize and follow how the blood moves through the heart and what's happening at the different parts. The second part of this worksheet is another set of labeling, only this time it's asking you to label different blood vessels. So instead of different parts of the heart, on this diagram, we're not going to label any arteries, or no, excuse me, you are going to be labeling arteries and veins, not so much the atria and ventricle. So again, we have A through H, and you're going to be looking for the aorta, the pulmonary artery, the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, the heart, the pulmonary vein, and the two lungs, the right lung and the left lung. So remember, the lungs are where the pulmonary arteries are going to, and they are where the pulmonary veins are leaving from. So hopefully that helps you recognize some of the different structures around the heart in terms of the different blood vessels, and kind of gives you an idea of where they're traveling and are they going away from the heart or back into the heart. So that is the notes and the worksheet for the circulatory system. As always, if you have any questions, you can email me, you can text me, you can post it on the Google Classroom, or you can come to one of our open Zoom office hours. In order to turn in your work, remember you can either make edits on the worksheet on your computer, print it off and write on the worksheet at home, or write down your answers to the worksheet on a different piece of notebook paper, and then take a picture or upload that document either to my phone number, you can text it to me, send it to me over email, or post it on the Google Classroom site. I hope that helps you all understand a little bit more about the circulatory system, and I will see you all for our next lecture in a few days.